AP Euro Scholars, greetings. We're doing our review for Unit 9 on European life and thought at the end of the 19th century, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom. Impressionist art, what you need to know is this is art done with small brush strokes with no outline, and it is depicting the changing qualities of light. The idea is impermanence and the movement of time. Cubism, this is where the artist paints the objects as broken apart and reassembled and seen from abstract, multiple new viewpoints. Example, Pablo Picasso. Surrealism, this is art that expresses the unconscious or the subconscious. It portrays dreams and alternate realities. An example of this would be Salvador Dali's art. Modernism is an even larger category. This is art that rejects the Christian religion and rejects Enlightenment reason, is critical of the status quo, critical of the middle class and its values, tends to be very subjective, and it represents the inner mood of the artist, often their anxiety, or their anger, or their frustrations. Some literary responses to European society at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Remember, you have Romanticism. This is art that often looks to the past and focuses on emotion, in contrast to the reason of the Enlightenment. You have Realism, which is often very serious, often kind of negative, sort of a mirror holding up to society, often hoping for a reaction of reform, perhaps. You've got Stream of Consciousness writing, which is a little bit sort of garbled, supposed to sort of represent the flux of human thought. You've got naturalism, which reflects the powerlessness of human beings in an indifferent and godless universe. Friedrich Nietzsche in Nihilism or Nihilism Nietzsche attacked Christianity as being passive, as stifling man's spirit. Nietzsche said there was no purpose, and this is no purpose in life, in the universe, and this is nihilism. Now, he's not a nihilist himself, it can be argued, but he says that we need to create a new purpose that will supersede Christianity. Max Weber is the author of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And he says that capitalism was caused by the English Calvinist Puritans who worried about their salvation. And because you could not know if you were saved, because they believed in the doctrine of election, also called predestination, the Puritans looked for signs of God's favor through their prosperity. God blesses those who serve him, who honor him. And if God blesses the faithful, then that's proof that you're saved. So what should you do? You should adopt the habits of hard work and sobriety and thrift and honesty, all characteristics that led to capitalism, that led to to prosperity. Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Edward Bernstein. Karl Marx, of course, is the author of the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. He is the proponent of communism. Lenin says that we can fast forward the revolution by party leaders who teach and organize and sort of jumpstart the revolution. You don't wait for the masses who have a false consciousness sort of leashing them, restraining them, but these party leaders will push the revolution forward through a violent revolution. And Edward Bernstein is a German, and he's a revisionist. He has what's called the Erfurt Program, and he looked at England. He's a little bit later than Marx chronologically, and he sees that the bourgeoisie, or that the middle class is not falling into the bottom ranks of the proletariat. Rather, the middle class is growing and prospering. And he sees through the English example that socialists should work through the democratic process. And he's labeled a revisionist. And Marx and Lenin looked at these guys like Edward as being accommodationists, opportunists, revisionists, that somehow they're being bought off by the bourgeoisie. They're going for only a piece of the pie when they could have the whole pie. Bloody Sunday, 1905, this is caused by, it follows Russia's loss in the Russo-Japanese War, essentially a war over control of Korea. And Russia loses this war very badly, in a very humiliating way, to the Japanese. And in 1905, you have protests across Russia that are springing from this unbottled frustration over lack of democracy, over economic exploitation in the factories and by landowners. And you have these marchers in St. Petersburg who are textile workers marching. They're being led by a priest, and they're carrying banners and icons, and it's a peaceful march. And they're fired upon in St. Petersburg, and close to 1,000 are killed by these Cossack troops. And this leads to strikes and riots and all across, land seizures all across Russia. And the Tsar is spooked, and he agrees to set up a Duma, and he does set up a representative legislature, very restricted, very conservative at first, but this is a big deal for the Romanov dynasty, and this happens after the Bloody Sunday of 1905. The Great Exhibition of 1851, also called the Crystal Palace, this was a glass building that held about 14,000 machines, and it was open to the public, and it was to show off British technological know-how. The pros and cons of industrialization, some of the cons, bad working conditions, long hours, low pay, child labor, growing slums, and destruction of the environment. But the pros are the city's in many ways a desirable place to be. It has electricity, you have culture, you've got shows and theater. Eventually you've got those Nickelodeons. You've got education in the cities. You have a rising standard of living for a growing middle class, which along with the poor, who, the slums are growing, the middle class is growing. So there's many things to like about the city as well as its problems and its dark side. Emmeline Pankhurst is the founder of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, which advocated the right to vote and also advocated violence, that there's a war against women by men, and the suffragettes, as they called themselves, were involved with bombings. They would smash windows. They were arrested by the government. They went on hunger strikes, and they were force-fed by the British cops and by the prison system. Theodor Herzl and Zionism. Herzl advocated that Jews should move to Palestine, that they should move to what we would call Israel today. He said the Jews had no place in Europe, and his assessment is after a century or so of assimilation and movement of Jews into the middle class, or at least the attempt, that Jews still weren't accepted, that there was discrimination, that there was anti-Semitism, and that Jews ultimately needed to chart out their own destiny back in Israel. Why was there a rise of anti-Semitism at the end of the 1800s? Well, for one thing, you have nationalism. These new nations and the growing nationalism in nations that did exist didn't see a place for Jews. They were considered, what is a Jew really? Fully a German, fully a Frenchman, fully a Russian? And the answer for most was no. And also Darwinism. Darwinism had a dark side, especially as it moved into what's called social Darwinism. And that saw some races were superior and some were inferior. And of course, many considered Jews not to be the equal of whatever, Nordics, Teutons, and what eventually Hitler calls the Aryan race. This is all added to the blood libel that the Jews are guilty of killing Christ, and accusation that Jews are sort of economic exploiters of Gentiles or Christians. Emigration, with an EMI, emigration refers to leaving, and these emigrants become immigrants when they make it to places like the United States. But tens of millions of immigrants left Europe in the 1800s and early 1900s to America, to Canada, to Latin America. Many went to Argentina in particular, to Brazil, and also to Australia. Challenges to European beliefs and morality, some names to know. Charles Darwin advocated natural selection, the idea of evolution, and he's challenging the idea that there is a purposeful creation by a creator God. Herbert Spencer, he is the advocate of social Darwinism, that natural selection applies to human society itself. And that within European society, you had those at the bottom, those at the top, such as the anti-Semitism, which placed Jews at the bottom. But also, social Darwinism will be used to justify the movement of Europeans into imperialism, imperializing, taking over much of Africa and Asia. Albert Einstein said, unlike Newton that matter is not fixed, but changing. Thus, that E equals mc squared equation, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And he says that time and space are relevant to the position of the observer. And he's challenging the idea of predictability in the material universe. Werner Heisenberg, looks like Warner Heisenberg, said the position of the electron in the atom is a matter of uncertainty. It's a matter of probability and, again, of relativity. Now, this idea of relativity in physics is going to sort of move into the idea of relativity in the sort of the social moral dimension. Sigmund Freud said that psychological problems are not spiritual or moral. They don't deal with Christian guilt, but they're simply matters of maladjustment or suppression of desires. And he began psychoanalysis to probe the subconscious for neuroses and repressed memories. And he divided that subconscious into the id, into the ego, and into the superego. Auguste Comte is the teacher of the idea of positivism, that human development moves from religion to philosophy and ultimately culminates in science. And Comte, like many in this Belle Epoque, are optimists that human society is only on an upward trajectory. Friedrich Schleiermacher is the father of Christian liberalism. And Christian liberalism didn't teach Christian guilt, didn't teach Jesus' divinity. And Schleiermacher claimed to be a Christian theologian. Modern-day evangelicals would probably say, really, he's not a Christian anymore if he's ignoring Christ's divinity. But the point here is his goal was to rescue Christianity from skeptics, from modern scientific critics. And his solution was that Christianity is not primarily obedience to a revealed outside authority, but Christianity is primarily an account of man's feelings, of man's religious experience. And basically, he's turning Christianity into part of this romanticism, emotionalism. It's not about objective faith and knowledge and reality, but it's about feeling. The Belle Epoque, is this idea of the good age, the good period, and the end of the 1800s. Before we get to World War I, there is a huge amount of optimism in Europe. This is a time of technological and medical and industrial growth and knowledge, and Europe is largely a time of peace between the Congress of Vienna and 1914's World War I breakout. There's this growing middle class, and there's wealth, there's confidence, especially when the Europeans get involved in taking over a lot of countries during the imperial age, which will be our next unit. That'll be Unit 10. Why were the British first in industrialization? Keep in mind, remember, the Europeans, their government is stable, it's divided. You have this constitutional monarchy with an accountable representative government. You have independent courts upholding property rights. You have good infrastructure, roads and canals. You've got easy access to ports by most of the people in the country, or all the people in the country. You have lots of coal, lots of iron. You have innovation and invention. You've got social mobility. You've got education. You've got relative religious freedom. And you have empire and trade. What don't the British have? They've got it all. Why was Eastern Europe lagging behind, in particular Russia? Well, you don't have the Renaissance, you don't have the Reformation, which are sort of exalting the dignity of man. You don't have the commercial revolution with this overseas trade. You don't have the agricultural revolution providing food for people to move to the cities, and you don't have an industrial revolution. And you certainly don't have, with not having the Enlightenment, you don't have your John Locke saying that that authority and sovereignty lie in the individual to put a check on absolute rule. And remember, the Tsar is an autocrat. He's an absolute ruler. And the significance of literacy. Literacy is the basis of industrial society. Literacy spread nationalism. And in the hands of government, literacy became a tool for propaganda and for indoctrination, especially control of schools. Think of the whole culture comp takeover by Bismarck of Catholic schools for the purpose of promoting nationalism in this new German state. Motivation for mass education. Well, again, politically, increasingly there's a number of voters who need to be made aware of their responsibilities and their capacity to exercise citizenship. Socially, education is necessary for entry into this growing middle class. And economically, Literacy is important for a technologically advanced society that needs literacy to both build and to run the machines of a modern age, especially knowledge of math and science. The Catholic Church, we're at the bottom of the sheet here, should know the syllabus of errors. At the end of the century, Pope Pius IX issues an encyclical slamming and criticizing rationalism, socialism, communism, liberalism, religious freedom, separation of church and state, and Protestantism. And if you are a defender of this at all, keep in mind here, you have these new states, these new nationalist movements in Italy and Germany are taking church property, shutting down monasteries, shutting down churches, and these are, very fiercely anti-clerical. You have in science, you have Darwinism challenging sort of, the existence of God, and you have sort of these anti-Christian beliefs of nihilism and this sort of glorification and worship of science, these things which are inherently unchristian, and the Pope is reacting sort of extremely with a very broad brush here, criticizing these values of this modern age. The First Vatican Council, which ends in 1870, sees the declaration of papal infallibility, and many people see this as a rearguard defense after the loss of the Pope's temporal powers. He loses control of the papal states and of Rome and the Vatican itself. And papal infallibility basically says in matters, and the official doctrine here is in matters of doctrine, the Pope is infallible. Doesn't mean the Pope is impeccable. Doesn't mean he can't be sinful and that he can't, doesn't need to go to confession. And it doesn't mean the Pope is infallible in his everyday comments and political positions, but it means that when he sits ex cathedra, when he sits in the chair of Peter, that he is speaking for Christ, that he's speaking infallibly. And the two doctrines that have been propagated since this First Vatican Council are the doctrine of papal infallibility, and secondly, the assumption of Mary, that Mary did not die, that she was not buried, but she was assumed bodily into heaven, for those of you who are theological curious. So here we go. Here's our review for this unit. Study early, study hard. Look over your notes. Be sure you've read the book. Good luck. Signing out.